You know what it's like when it's grey in East London. It's horrible. It's concrete city. There was a condom and a needle on the church doorstep. The house was being rented to these young lads making porn. And I was like, she's going to say no. Becky looked at me and she said, this is where God's called us to be.
Brilliant.
Those two items on the doorstep, I would say that they were signs of what our ministry was going to be about here.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired is all about listening to various friends of mine from different walks of life and hearing how God's been at work in their lives through difficult times maybe, but triumphant overcoming faith in the nitty and gritty of what discipleship looks like. And I'm really excited this week to have with us Cris Rogers. Welcome, Cris.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be with you today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So Cris, we first met about 5 years ago at Spring Harvest. He's now the chairman of Spring Harvest. He's also, his full-time job, if you like, is as rector of All Hallows Church in Bow. Funny enough, I lived, I think about 1997, 98, I lived around the corner. I never went to that church. It's a big population of Sylheti, Bangladesh, about 70% or whatever. So there's lots of deprivation in that area. And we've just done a podcast together on his podcast, which is Making Disciples, and mutual friends. Well, Luke is one of my trustees, Luke Johnson. Luke and Marina, they're in your church, and I know they love it. And he said, come on, get Cris on. So that's why we're here, Cris. And I'm excited to have you. I've loved being on your podcast. And so let's go for it. You know, give me a bit of context, childhood, journey to faith.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is my mum and dad weren't churchgoers when I was going, when I was little. And I think the vicar did a good gig when they got married. My dad was into the Rolling Stones, he was into the Beatles, the Who, and the vicar did a good gig. And they decided to go back after that good gig that was their wedding to have me baptised as a baby. And he did another good gig. And that really was the thing that they then were hooked in to this church. And they carried on going. So I grew up in a working class mining village in West Yorkshire. And we grew up going to this Anglican church that really was quite an interesting place when I look back. You're so critical as a kid, aren't you? I was so cynical and critical, but they were really experiencing Toronto. Little mining village, and they on a Sunday night they'd have this outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and it really was somebody who'd been to Toronto kind of thing, and it was really, really special. I think I was so critical. I mean, you look at yourself and go, what an obnoxious teenager, but for me there was this thing of my grandparents lived on the council estate, and I went to the local school. It was a really working class school, and I looked at what was happening on a Sunday night, and I was like, what difference is Jesus making on the estate? What difference is Jesus making in the school? And it seemed to me there was a lot of Holy Spirit stuff wafting around, but there was no impact being made on the local community. So I wasn't that highly bought in to Jesus at all, although grew up going to what I now look back on as a very wonderful church. But that wasn't necessarily how I would have described it at the time, in that cynical teenage years. But at the age of 15 and a half, the Gideons, this is just bonkers really, but the Gideons they came to the school and they gave me a little red leather Bible. That little red leather Bible I put in my bedside cabinet and I just left it. And really approaching that age of 16, exams, GCSEs, there was a whole string of things for me that I was struggling with dyslexia. Big problem with dyslexia growing up, not being understood. School didn't understand it. It was in a generation when dyslexia wasn't a thing. You didn't know what that was. But I was really struggling with my dyslexia. Struggling with watching late night Channel 5. Pornography in those days was Channel 5 late nights. And, that was going on. Watching it on my TV in my bedroom, that was going on. Friendships and relationships, there was just felt like there was so much that was just falling apart, really. And I remember one night just pulling out that little red gospel. And I remember thinking to myself, cheapskates have only given me half a Bible. And it was just the New Testament and the Psalms. So I just started reading the Gospels. It was the best thing they could have given me because no Genesis, no Leviticus, no Numbers, Deuteronomy. It was just straight into the Gospels. And I read through the Gospels and I remember saying to myself, I am not interested in Christianity. I have no interest in Christianity. but I am interested in this Jesus.
Yeah.
And it was something like reading that gospel that made me go, do you know what? I want to follow Jesus. So I remember at the age of about 15 and a half, 16, that age bracket, I remembered reading the Gospels and going, do you know what? This is the guy that I want to follow. And then it was about 6 months in where I'd really made this commitment one night reading the Gospels, where I remember saying, I was just laid in bed praying, and I really felt like the Lord said to me, and it was the first time I really would say that I heard God speak to me, but I felt like the Lord said to me, would you ever tell your best friend that his girlfriend is ugly?
Right.
And I was like, no, Lord, I wouldn't. He said, why did you do that about my bride then? And I just had this real profound sense that I couldn't fall in love with Jesus if I was not going to accept Jesus and the baggage that came with him.
Yeah.
If I was going to fall in love with Jesus and the Gospels, then I had to fall in love with the church that Jesus was building. You know, Shane Claiborne, I love it when he says, you know, that the body of Christ often looks like a whore, but we're called to love her. Yeah. And, you know, at the age of 16, just having this real sense of, oh my gosh, if I'm accepting Jesus, then I'm accepting his bride. And I had to then start falling in love with his church. And I remembered I got involved. There was a lady, a dear lady that died in the pandemic from COVID. She was my Sunday school teacher, but she was now leading the 11 to 14s, and I'm now 16. And she said to me, why don't you, Cris, come and help me on a Sunday morning with the 11 to 14s? And she got me Bible teaching. She got me leading the little Sunday school group with her. And she was the first person that really discipled me. Yeah. And she was talking into my life all the way through those couple of years. And she was the first person that said to me, Cris, you should be thinking about leadership. If you're going to follow Jesus, you need to think about leadership. And she was the first one that really started to challenge me that if Jesus has really turned your life upside down like you claim he has, then that change needs to be around where you're heading with your life as well. And just to give a bit of backstory, so hate maths, hate science, hate English. It's all written work. Love drawing, love painting, love making, love design, love drama, love the creative stuff. And I was heading, the plan of my life really was to go on to do art, creative stuff. I want to go to art college. Eventually I got a place actually to go to Goldsmiths in London, film and photography, or, you know, filmmaking. You know, that's the way my brain is wired. So I'm all set for art college and then go to university to study art. And she's saying, if you're gonna take Jesus seriously, then you need to take him seriously in where you're heading. And then time trots on, and I'm now at art college. I'm in my first year, end of my first year, and I really heard, I was on a camp, like a summer camp, a youth mission. And I just really felt like the Lord said to me, do you know what, Cris, you need to go to theological college. You need to learn more about me. And that's true. I only had the New Testament. I needed to know the whole thing. And I really just felt this sense of call on my life to go and learn more about him, not knowing where that would lead or what that would come to. I want you to go and learn more about me. So I ended up making a pivot, and rather than going to art college, I went to theological college. And so essentially my story was, you know, coming to faith, reading this New Testament, and then just having the right person speak to me and say, Cris, are you really taking Jesus fully seriously? Because if you are, it's going to change the direction of your life.
Yeah. I love hearing those Gideon stories because, you know, those Bibles get all over the world, don't they? And you just don't know which ones are going to lead to life change. And then that precious lady, God bless her. And we can all be that lady, can't we? Coming alongside some younger person who's sort of struggling to find their way. So bless her indeed. So which theological place did you go to?
I got all the prospectuses for all the colleges I could get my hands on, and there was one that had a dove on the front. And I thought, well, if that's this is because I work visually. Okay. I'm thinking if that's where the Spirit is, that's where I want to go. So I ended up going to Trinity College, Bristol, which is an Anglican vicar training college.
Yeah, not far from here.
So if you were essentially if I was going to pick colleges, you know, it maybe wouldn't have been that one if I was choosing it from the sense of a course. But it was very clear that was the one with the dove on the front, and it drew me to it. And it was purely the leading of the Spirit over anything else. So Trinity College in Bristol. So I moved there in 97 to go and do a degree in theology. It was the most formational 3 years that I hated.
Oh, right.
And I did everything I could to squirm around in it. I wanted to be the rebellious one, whilst at the same time, it was just what I needed.
And were you already married to Becky by this stage?
No.
Right.
So I arrive and I actually was dating somebody else from home. That relationship kind of wound up at the end of the first year. When you just get that sense of my life now going somewhere, and is this relationship going the same direction I'm going in? And it's really hard, isn't it, when you talk about relationships with people, because there's an element of you may really love somebody and like them and want to be with them, but if their life's heading in one direction, yours is heading the other, it's just never gonna work. And I just got this sense that there was a trajectory, and this trajectory of my life meant that I needed to be able to go wherever the Lord wanted me to go and not be bound back to my home, West Yorkshire, where I grew up. So that relationship ended, and Becky arrived at the beginning of my second year. And, for the first 6 months to 9 months, she was just another student, a friend, and nothing else really. It wasn't until really the end of that year that something started to kind of started to happen. And I was really surprised that she was remotely interested in me. I was the guy who was there not training to be a vicar. I was the guy just doing some theology, and she was the one that had got planned for her life. She'd been called to ordination. She was heading somewhere. And so in some ways, I was like, why would she be interested in me? But yeah, that's where we met. And it wasn't until after I left Trinity that we ended up getting married. But in some ways, I don't want to skip past those 3 years at Trinity, because there was something about that institution that I really struggled with. But actually, I ended up getting a job at Jessop's on White Ladies Road in Bristol, because I just got so fed up hanging out with Christians.
Yeah.
So I ended up, getting a job. And really, that's what helped me pay my way through theological college. I wanted to be able to do this and have freedom to go on and do whatever I was going to do. And I got this job at Jessop's, and it was great. I loved working with non-Christians on a Saturday and Sunday afternoon, this Saturday job, hanging out with people that I in my head were normal.
Yeah.
And really then being able to work out, well, how does this gospel that I'm learning about transform these relationships that I have here with these people who, one of them ended up inspiring my dissertation, because he was really into nightclubbing. And he would go to secret raves, and he'd leave work, and he would be doing the speed and other drugs to get him through the night. And he'd club in a forest or somewhere, all night, and then come straight to work the next day in the same clothes that he left in. Wow. So I was really interested in how do you reach somebody like that. And so those people influenced then my missional mind. To how does this translate? How do you contextualize this thing of Jesus into that life? So those 3 years were really quite strategic for me in growing in my missional mind.
Yeah. And so what did that lead on to?
So I started skateboarding while I was in Bristol. I think everybody goes to Bristol and learns skateboarding. If you're a young guy, it just seemed to be what you did if you were white. I ended up going to Birmingham. I went to a church that had been liberal Anglo-Catholic, and there was an evangelical vicar who was really wanting to birth a youth ministry and see this church transformed. And a guy called Peter Howell-Jones, and he was just awesome. He invited me to come and be the youth worker and to just dream about what youth work might look like there, because there hadn't been any. The week I arrived, the church had just had the car park redone, tarmacked. So I was like, this is a great place for skating. And one afternoon, I caught a bunch of young people skateboarding in the church car park, and they didn't go to the church. I was thinking, you know what, we could do something with this. So we ended up getting some wood together, and we built a skate park. And it was almost like a pop-up skate park. We had to work out how the heck we could build these half pipes so they could pack up into a shed and then be brought out and put away and brought out. So we started a skate park. And for me, that new mission field was young kids, young lads predominantly, who were learning to skate. And my job was to work out how I reached them with the gospel at this skate park. And, it was 2 years in, and one night a young lad and I were talking, and he said, so tell me about Jesus then. So I ended up sharing the gospel with him, and he was like, he's calling his friends over. He kept going, you got to hear this, got to hear this. That night we had 21 young people come to faith.
Oh, beautiful.
And that was then the birth of a congregation that at the time we called it the Gathering. And it was basically, it was a youth congregation trying to reach these kids who were coming to the skate park. So the influence for me of that time at Trinity was, how do we contextualize the gospel so you can reach people groups that the church has struggled to reach?
Yeah.
And it's just that people group in that space were young lads who were skaters. So what's that look like? So I was there for around 5 years doing that and absolutely loved it. Formational, loved the people, loved wrestling through those big questions. What does church look like to reach those on the edge? Now, the edge in some places is urban estates like I am now in. In other places, the edge are young people that are skaters in a middle-class neighborhood. The edge, every neighborhood has an edge. It's how do you get the gospel to the edge? That's what was really living and breathing in me and still does today.
Yeah. Listener, what is your edge? Where is the edge in your context? It's we've got to engage, haven't we? That's where we're meant to be. So, there's all these different building blocks in our lives, aren't there? Different chapters. So was the next one Harrow?
Yeah, so Becky got ordained, moved to the next door parish to where I was, very Anglican language parish. But, she became the next door, a trainee vicar at the next door church. A great time. And at the end of that, there was just this clear call to the new thing. And I'd just finished my master's in theology, looking at ecclesiology. What does it mean to be church? And off the back of that, I'd found Soul Survivor Harrow, a plant really from Soul Survivor Watford. So the natural step for me was to become almost like a bit of Bible teacher at Soul Survivor Harrow. So we moved to Harrow for 5 years, and it was a great 5 years. Loved the people, loved the place, loved what we were doing. But there was something about that space, Harrow, just didn't, it was hard for me. And I really, and I want to be careful what I say because I absolutely adored the people.
Yeah.
I absolutely adored what was going on. But there was something about being yet again in a middle class suburb that really did not help my soul.
Yeah.
And over those 5 years that we were there, we had such a good time with what the Lord was doing. But every time I opened the Gospels, I came to a passage where Jesus went to the edge.
Yeah.
He went to the abandoned place. He went to the person that was sidelined. And I could not shake off. Every time I came to scripture, the Lord was leading me. And I remember reading the passage in Luke where Jesus is walking down the borderland between Samaria and Galilee. And it says that he's walking in this space between Galilee and Samaria, and he comes across lepers. And what you've got here is a concentration camp for lepers, because if you had leprosy, you were sent out from the town into the edges, and you've got this concentration camp for the unclean. And Jesus is walking past this concentration camp for the unclean, and in that borderland, he encounters these lepers, and he speaks healing and restoration, and lives are transformed. And I just kept coming across these metaphors of borderlands, edges, people on the edge. And the more I did that, the more uncomfortable. So those 5 years in Harrow really were brilliant. Loved it. Need to be very careful with what I say, but my inner soul was really struggling.
Yeah.
And feeling like there was somewhere else we were meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere else we were meant to be. And it really was a little bit like a bird in a nest, and the nest was constantly being stirred up. It was an uncomfortable place. Loved it, but very uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, the way you're talking is very similar to how I would talk of we had 2 fantastic years in South Carolina, launching our charity Great Lakes Outreach over there. And I loved it and got so many fantastic friends over there. But I came back after the first year, having done some preaching in England for our second year. And I said to Lizzie, people are great and we were experiencing so much grace and hospitality, but I feel like my soul is shriveling. I'm dying inside. And it's just a question of how we're wired, isn't it? Clearly, you were not wired for Harrow, and I wasn't wired to long-term live in Charleston, South Carolina, however fun and even fruitful those episodes were for us. So the Lord was drawing you to your edge, which was, I'm guessing, All Hallows Bow. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you can see stepping stones start to emerge. Isn't it interesting how the Lord leads you to the next place where something happens that you need to get you to the next place? And so I moved to Harrow, meet Bishop Pete Broadbent, and Bishop Pete says, "It's ridiculous, Chris, you need to be ordained." And Pete Broadbent got me ordained whilst I was at Soul Survivor. That next stepping stone, because of my tribe, I'm Anglican, that next step was what I then needed to get me to where I am now, which is home.
Right.
And there's something now about where we are feels home. And the reason, so the church that I'm now at, All Hallows Bow, had been a church that hadn't thrived for many, 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 many years. And the previous leader here wasn't legally put in as the incumbent. He was just put in here to close the church. Right. And he'd been given a number of years and told, go close All Hallows Bow. Let it decline and let's get it shut. It's not functioning well. And he came for 3 years, and after 3 years, he was like, no, something needs to happen here. This is a place where life could be birthed. And the bishop disagreed with him, the bishop of this area. And he said, I want you out within 3 months. And he was moved on. And the church then remained leaderless for numbers of years. Congregation of 7, all in that hitting retirement phase of life, or already in retirement. And they were really fighting to keep this church open. They knew they wanted to keep their church open, but there are no resources to do it in a very Bengali neighborhood, aging congregational members. The story to get here is fun. So I approached Pete Broadbent and say, Bishop, I really feel like the Lord's calling us to somewhere tough. Send me to the church that you're going to close to an area of town you can't get a young evangelical to move to. And in 2010, there were not many evangelical churches on mission, Anglican mission happening here in Tower Hamlets. There was a number of non-denominational evangelical churches, but there wasn't the Anglican move. And at that time, we were still looking in West London. He said, Chris, I haven't got anything for you. And we ended up on a bit of an adventure trying to find somewhere to plant. We thought it was going to be Croydon for a while. That looked really possible. We got the money to plant. We got the building to plant. But then when we went to talk to some folk there about planting, it really felt like the Lord was closing that door. That wasn't happening. And I ended up making a phone call to somebody that I knew that I got ordained with and said, look, I just really feel like the Lord's leading us to plant somewhere. The perimeters are somewhere that's going to close to an area of town you can't get young evangelicals to go to. And he actually put me in contact with a Church of England vicar over this way who said, Chris, have you seen All Hallows Bow? And I spoke to Bishop Pete, and Pete went, do you know what, All Hallows, that's a bright idea. So I went to the Bishop of London to pitch to him the idea of replanting into All Hallows Bow, and I went to see him with no strategy really. I had some notes of paper with some thoughts on about what we could do. And I arrived, I put my dog collar on. I don't really wear my dog collar very often, but I thought I need to be really official here. I walked through the door. I took with me the vicar of the church that I'd spoken to that had pitched All Hallows to me, took him with me as well. Walked through the door, sat down with Bishop Richard, and he was like, beloved, what can I do for you? And he's got this amazing voice. Yes, and I sat there, my heart is beating, and we said, look, All Hallows Bow, East London. He said, I know it very well. He'd been the bishop over this way years before. He said, that church has never thrived. And I said, well, I'd love to go and do something there. And he opens up his Filofax and says, when do you want to start?
Wow.
And it was just like this incredible move where God's just opening doors. And the fun thing was the house that's attached to the church was being rented to some young men, 5 young men, and they were running a business from the house called Wazzle Limited, and they were making porn movies from the rectory. So the bedroom that Becky and I have is where they were filming and making stuff. They were editing it on site, putting it out on site. Growing marijuana in the garden, you couldn't joke about this stuff. Yeah. The folk in the church knew none of this was happening in what would have been the old vicarage, the rectory. So it wasn't. The first piece of mail that we got when we eventually moved here was a French maid costume. But we came to, the first time we came to look around, Becky and I looked around. It was January 2010. It was raining. It was grey. You've lived in East London, so you know what it's like when it's grey in East London. It's horrible. It's concrete city. There was a condom and a needle on the church doorstep. And I was like, she's going to say no. She's going to say this is no. And Becky looked at me and she said, this is where God's called us to be.
Brilliant.
I was like, oh my gosh. And even now, as I say, this is where God's called us to be, there's this like welling up in me where it really was. Becky's the prophetic one between us. She gets these senses of what the Lord is saying. She's like, this is where the Lord is called to be. Then I got this overwhelming sense from my heart of, oh my gosh, this is what the Lord wants. And just now as I share it, my eyes have, catch water in them because, this is where the Lord wants us to be. But the devil's still trying to put us off. I came to visit a service here. There was only 7 in the congregation, some visiting old vicar that was here to do the service. And it was February. And during the service, this wasp came and stung me in the February.
Yeah, nuts.
What wasp stung me? It was really weird. But it was almost like I felt like the devil was trying his hardest to put me off. I was like, if that's the best you can do. But yeah, he's had a really good go of the last 13 years spiritual attack, for sure. Like we can talk about spiritual attack. But, there was a real clear sense this is where the Lord wanted us to be. The house was being rented to these young lads making porn. So it was a whole redemption story from this sense of God's call to being here. We really clearly knew. And what's really interesting is those 2 items on the doorstep, I would say that they were signs. Now I look back and go, flipping it, Lord. They were signs for what our ministry was going to be about here. Yeah. Those 2 items in them do say a lot about that call that God's placed on us. It's like a prophetic sign for what this ministry would be a lot about.
And I'm sure plenty of your mates are saying, man, this is like career suicide to taking on a church of 7.
How do you know? You've just quoted something someone said to me. So we announced we're moving to Tower Hamlets, and a really good friend of mine said to me, Cris, you're committing Christian career suicide. That was the words that they used. And this person said, oh, Cris, I want to see you speak at conferences. I really want to see you Bible teach. But if you go there, you're committing career suicide. And my heart said, but nobody even told me there was a career in this thing. All I'd done was I'd read this Gideon's Bible. I'd been led to learn more about him at college. I'd been led to Birmingham, where we planted a skate park and a skate church and reaching young people. I'd been led to Harrow, that felt uncomfortable but was an amazing place. And then God led us here. It was like, there was never a talk of a career. There was never real conversation about what we would get paid or what benefits we would get from any of this ministry. It was just purely the Lord's leading. So yes, you are word for word right for what was said to me. You are committing Christian career suicide. And when it was announced at the church that we were leaving Harrow, the person that announced us leaving, it sounded like we were moving to Beirut. Becky and I looked at us, looked at each other. It was like, oh my gosh, it's for them moving to East London, a neighborhood that is Bengali, that is filled full of poverty. In that neighborhood's mind, we were moving to Beirut. If we'd have said we were going to Iraq, it would have had the same response. The congregation that day, well, that's very brave. And I'm thinking, guys, we're moving across the city. And maybe there was some naivety in all of it. But having grown up in West Yorkshire in a mining village, there was nothing scary about moving here, as far as I could see. It's deprivation. There's some real problems around recovery and alcohol and drug addiction. Was it 4 Christmases ago? Us in the church were burgled 5 times in 4 weeks. Yes, it's a difficult place, but it's not what they'd got in their mind.
So you've had 13 years. You've alluded to some sucker punches, some sort of heavy duty attacks. But share us the nitty gritty and stories of lives transformed. That's what brings inspiration, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, arriving here 13 years ago, not much of a plan of what we were going to do, but we just knew we wanted to live out the gospel, and we wanted people to see the gospel. So one of the big things for us is we want to be a church that throws the best parties. Our vision is to be be an explosion of joy in this neighborhood. If the gospel starts like an explosion of joy, then we want people to see that. So we just arrived with a real naivety of what this would look like. We just want to live deep. We want to live with people. We want to do life together. So we live in community. Our household, from top to bottom, could hold 12 individuals, and we had 12 living with us right until the summer. Brilliant. When the family that lived in the basement moved out, and some renovation work happening there. But yes, we live in communities. My family, my wife, my 2 kids. My son's 18 now. My daughter's 16 in January. But when they arrived, they were children. They were little. And then we've had interns and people who are on mission come and live with us for seasons, and a year or 2 or 3 or 4. Joanna, who lives with us, I think she's been with us for 5 years now. But doing life together, seeing the house as a place that we model life together, model community. The church has grown, and we've planted 2 congregations, 2 churches from us now in East London. Wonderful. Both because God really clearly called us to plant in 2 particular places. So we've sent people out to plant churches. We are not interested in growing a big church. The plan is not to grow big. The plan is to grow, to give away. So I'll just tell you the story of my mate Raf, because he's going to be leading the next church plant in the next 2 years. That's the vision. Raf was an addict 9 years ago. He encountered recovery, got clean from drugs, but realized that he was still addicted to stuff. Drug addiction for him was the medicine for the problems of his soul. Drugs were not the issue, his soul was, and eventually got to a place where he knew that he needed something that was going to change his life radically. Came to faith, got baptized 7 years ago, and then we had this conversation where he was like, I'd really love to plant a congregation that reaches recovering addicts. So started something on a Tuesday night that's there to reach recovering addicts. And 4 years ago, I said to him, mate, I'd really love to invest in you strategically and see you become a leader. So he went on to lead this congregation. Just over 3 years ago, he started training, doing some theology. Not a degree in theology, but just a certificate in theology. A level that was appropriate for him. And just this last June, he got ordained. He's now ordained as my curate at the church. And so he's doing 3 years training with me, and he's going to be planting a church in 2 years' time. Not just for recovering addicts, but it will really have a recovery feel, because salvation from sin is recovery. Yeah. So that's the narrative. We want to see people go from no faith to some faith to fully in to following Jesus to growing in leadership and then deploying them for that mission. That's what we want to see that through. And my big passion is to grow people who will reach this kind of neighborhood. We don't need more white middle class leaders in East London. We need more East Londoners for East London. Yeah. So the vision then is, well, how do we mobilize and grow working class leaders? So that's the big passion from us, is to do that. But let me just tell you about some of the things that we do, because do you know the stuff that we do is only because God has told us and led us to do it. Right. So little things like on our estate, this is all about God's provision. If there's God's mission happening, then God provides, doesn't he? And there was an elderly day centre right in the middle of our estate, and we want to reach this Bengali community, but we can't do it with a Church of England building because all they see is Christianity. So we're praying over this elderly day centre. They're serving about 10 elderly people lunch each day, and that's it. And we just got on our knees one day and prayed outside that building and said, Lord, would we get more involved? About 6 months later, I get an email from the chair of trustees going, Reverend, do you realise there's a position on the board for the local vicar? Would you like to join the trustees board of Fern Street Settlement? I was like, mate, I would love to. And I thought that was the Lord answering my prayer. I'm on it for a period of time, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, when so we go to a conference, Becky and I, in the July, and while worshiping, Becky gets this phrase, game changer. We are not into football, we're not into rugby, we're not into sport at all. I'm a creative artist. So game changer is not our language. So it doesn't sit with us because it's not our kind of language, but that was a clue that was something from the Lord. Came back off holiday in September to a letter on my desk. All the staff at Fern Street Settlement had resigned. Wow. It's not working. This isn't tenable. Finances is running out. We're resigning. I thought, no, Lord, that wasn't the plan. And then about 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from the chair of trustees saying the other trustees have been talking. We're wondering about gifting the centre back to you guys at the church, so you can put all the work that you're doing, this transformation work from the church, put it into this centre. So we got gifted the building, and he said, what we'll do is you need to pay for any of the work that happens in the centre, but we will maintain the building for you. So the lighting will be on, the heating will be on, the Wi-Fi will be on, the roof will be kept functioning. You just need to pay for the work that happens from it. So we did this deal 9 years ago, and since then we now serve 600 to 700 individuals a year.
Fantastic.
ESOL classes, cookery classes, youth work, children's work. We do quite a bit supporting women in domestic violent relationships, supporting families in need. We've got a food bank. We've got all of that stuff running from that place. And we're just seeing some phenomenal transformation in people's lives. So a couple of folk have come to faith through that work and now serving in other areas, coming to faith. Some, it's just Bengali women encountering people that genuinely love them. Yeah. And you're not doing it because you want to convert to being a follower of Jesus, although that's the agenda of everything. They just know we're loving them. And we care for them no matter what. They may not be tithing to the church, but we're serving them anyway. No agenda. That stuff is just, the impact is just incredible. Yeah. And 3 years ago, we opened a coffee shop on the front of the church with the idea of becoming a community hub, a place where everybody can go from first contacts to friendships. We employ a Bengali guy a Muslim convert, who works in the cafe with our manager. But what's really fun now is, the reason I'm telling you this is, we've now got Bengali women who are coming out of domestic violent relationships. We're getting them into flats. They've got no income. And we've been able to bring them into our coffee shop and say, look, why don't you work with us for 3 to 6 months? We will then get you a really good reference, and we're going to get you some full-time work. So we're actually seeing people now being deployed into full-time work through that, from Fern Street through to the coffee shop's called a haba, means love in Arabic and love in Hebrew. So we're seeing people now getting into work and becoming sustainable, which has just been just a joy, seeing people go from no confidence to filled full of confidence. And now one woman started a business. She now runs the baking business from her own home because of the work that she's done at the Harbour Cafe.
Cris, so good. Love it. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. So I gather that you nearly bankrupted the church, but then obviously you didn't. God provided. What was that story?
So we were 6 years into the church plant. We're only just becoming sustainable. And that summer, we had 3 incidents happen. The first was I was in a prayer meeting, and one of our old guard came to me during that prayer meeting. She said, I don't know why, Cris. I feel like the Lord is telling me to tell you, have you noticed that the bus goes from outside All Hallows and it goes all the way up to Canning Town? I don't know why I need to tell you that. I was like, no, neither do I, but thank you very much. I then go with Benedict, who's my assistant minister, to a conference in Denmark on Bible teaching on the power of the Holy Spirit. And at the end of the conference, somebody comes to us both and said, I don't know why the Lord's told me to tell you this, Cris and Benedict, but I feel like the Lord is saying, watch the buses. And I don't think much of it at the time. I've watched the buses. That doesn't make much sense to me. Okay, thank you very much. Forgetting what Sandra had said about the 323 bus. And then we come back, and that September, I got an email And the email was from a vicar in Canning Town. He said, I'm about to retire, and the church I have here is a congregation of 3.
Wow.
Have you ever thought about All Hallows Bow doing a church plant over this way and sending a few people to revitalize this church? So I put the postcode in, and do you know what? I realized that the bus that runs from outside the church runs all the way to and ends just down the road from where this church is.
Wow.
So watch the buses. The 323 bus goes to Canning Town, Cris. Hey, have you thought about planting in Canning Town?
Yeah.
Well, where's the church? At the end of the bus route. And it was just, when the Lord gives you 3 very clear pictures, I ended up emailing the bishop because it's across diocesan boundaries. If you listen as a non-denominational, this may make no sense, but I'm in London. This church is just at the end of the bus line. It's only about 10 minutes from us, but it's in another diocese, Chelmsford. So I emailed the bishop of Chelmsford and said, look, can I talk to you about something? We went to see the bishop and said, look, got these 3 words from the Lord. We just feel like we want to talk to you about St. Matthias. And in the end, we walked out that meeting with, yes, we'll give you the keys. So Benedict, it was agreed that he would now go and plant. So he just said to the congregation, look, anybody want to go with them? If there's a bunch of folk that would like to go with them to plant a church in Canning Town, let us know, because we'd love to send them. And we saved up a bit of money, saved up about £20,000. It's not a huge sum, but for our church, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And we just really felt like the Lord said, send them with this £20,000 and send them with whoever wants to go. So we did. We sent them off. Now, this became, we sent them off in the August, and we got to the end of the year. We muddled through okay. But as we start to get to Easter the following year, I start to watch the church bank account and realize it's now in free fall. The finances are just not adding up. And I'm watching the bank and nobody else is panicking, but I'm starting to think this isn't right. I ended up having a meeting and we realized we've sent our biggest givers. I don't know who gives in my church, and I don't know how much they give.
Yeah.
For me, it's not important if you give £1 or £100 or £1,000. What's interesting to me is, are you giving sacrificially? And then we'll see how much we've got in the common pot. Well, it just turned out I'd actually sent the biggest givers.
Right.
And it just turned out that one of the biggest givers was somebody who was very much giving more than everybody else dramatically. So we've sent our biggest givers. Now, you should probably say to me, Cris, your strategy should have been to suss that stuff out a bit earlier. But in my naivety of following the Lord, I'm like, the Lord will provide. We're now in free fall. I realized that by August we'd be bankrupt. So I have a meeting with the archdeacon as one of the people that function underneath the bishop, but above me. I have a meeting with the archdeacon and just said, look, this is what's happening. And the archdeacon said to me, Cris, you've made a massive mistake. You should never have done that church plant. You're too early in your days of being a church plant. You needed another 10 years to really solidify yourselves before you planted. This is a big mistake. And I think you'll look back on it from a ministry perspective with regret. So I left that meeting really quite demoralized, and I'm waking at 4:00 in the morning, just panic.
Stress. Yeah.
Just stressing over this. Gosh, I've made this mistake. But well, Lord, why would you have told me to do it if it wasn't right? Do you know we got to the end of the year and our finances added up? I can't tell you how, but it just did add up. The following year came and somehow the Lord provided and it just added up. But over that 6-month period, we were just seeing this total free fall. And some of that change was pretty a congregation. Hey guys, we've planted and it's cost us. Some of it was the Lord was adding to our number daily whom he was saving. Some of it was the Lord drawing people to our church who loved the vision of the church, who maybe were worshiping in the city and were saying, I think I need to lean into a local church. So all of that just got us that place again that was good and balanced. And sillily, having nearly bankrupted the church that year, 2.5 years after that, we planted again.
Superb.
And really, we changed the model slightly for the second plant, but it didn't scare us enough to not do it again. And it won't scare us enough, but we did nearly bankrupt the church. And the archdeacon, from an earthly perspective, is completely right. She was bang on that it was a silly thing to do. I was in Iraq earlier this year, and I was talking to Bishop Paulus, and he said this phrase, and it's really just, for me, sat heavy with me. He said this: logic and reality says the church in Iraq will die, but the Spirit says otherwise.
Yeah.
I love that. And do you know what? In 2016, logic and reality said the church was going to be bankrupted that summer because of the free fall of the cash. Logic said it was stupid to send our biggest givers to plant a church. Logic said this was really not wise, but the Spirit said otherwise.
Yeah.
And daring to live in a place where we're not so foolish that we're just being foolish, but living in this place where the Spirit is driving the bus, and the Spirit saying otherwise, that space is where you see life, you see transformation, you see hope, you see the abundance of God's provision. And that's not that I don't still now wake now and again with, oh my gosh, like what we're going to do about this. But choosing to live, no, I'm choosing to walk in the Spirit. And I really believe God called us here. We've seen clearly God's call through the work that we've been doing here. God has provided over and over and over and over again. He's never, ever let us down. So why will he let me down tomorrow? Because he's not let me down until today. So walking in that place of the Spirit, it has been what, if you said, Chris, what has the Lord taught you in 13 years? The Lord has taught me logic and reality says that this church will die out, but the Spirit says otherwise.
Yes. Hey, listen, we're running out of time, but you mentioned Iraq there, and I think that ties in with your work Spring Harvest, chairman of Spring Harvest, and that was with Open Doors as well. Top stories or touching moments from your time in Iraq?
Yeah, so I went out there to essentially go and encourage the church, pray for the church out there in Iraq that's been really affected by ISIS. But it was also to go and learn and to be changed by. And I met with Bishop Daniel Shimon. He's the Bishop of Baghdad. And I was chatting to him one day. I said, look, what's your strategy for church here? Your churches have been bombed. They've been burnt. What's the plan for the church? And he said, we're not interested in opening churches. I've told my priests, don't open any more churches. We don't need any more churches. I'm thinking, okay, interesting strategy. He then said, I'm telling them to open centers of hope. He said, I want them to open centers of hope. Yes, there's a place to gather and worship and pray, but I want them to have trauma counseling centers, support centers. I want them to have education and discipleship centers. I want them to care for the most vulnerable. I want them to have food support. Want them to do micro loans to start new businesses, kingdom businesses. I want them to open repair shops for cars and furniture and carpentry and training people up in being a repair shop. So, this center of hope. And if the church isn't, you could say, well, like Chris, this is just a play on words. The church is a center of hope. But I think naming it as a center of hope, the church being a center of hope, changes your mental gymnastics about what you're about. So often church is about building this up so it's sustainable, having enough bums on seats. Being a center of hope, it moves your trajectory outwards. It's becoming a place of transformation, an antiseptic. It's a place to show and reveal the gospel. So for me, that massive take home, becoming a center of hope, trauma counseling, support, education, discipleship, caring for the vulnerable, food, micro loans, repair shops, carpentry shops. That's what the church. So I'm saying to people now, what would happen if every church in the nation closed this year and we reopened as a center of hope? What would it look like? What would be different about what we were doing if we would live for that vision rather than the vision that we've got at the moment for church?
Yeah. Mate, that's brilliant. Hey, listen, time has run out, but is there anything we haven't covered that you really wanted to share? Go for it.
No, I think my big passion is to live on the edge. And for some, it's to move to Burundi. Hey, Simon. Some, it's to go minister in Lebanon. Some, it's to go minister in Liberia or Iraq or all of those crazy places. Some of us, it's called to live on the edge of our middle-class neighborhood, looking for the families in need. Some of us, it's to relocate to the inner city urban environments. But what is it for us? What is your edge? That really, for me, is where we should be and are being called as disciples. Some of us, it doesn't mean moving home. It just means moving relationships, being aware of a different tribe of people. for some of us, it may well be a call to relocate our lives to a new space where you are living with those that you are different to and having to contextualize the gospel. But that for me is the burden on my heart, is living on the edge, that place. And yes, there are seasons we need to come back and retreat into a place where we can recuperate. I don't think we can live in that place. We're not called to live on the sofa in safety. We are called to move to the edge. So there are seasons to this, for sure. If somebody's living on the edge right now, they've been living there for 15 years, there may be a season coming of just coming back and recuperating. But you can't live in the recuperation. We've got to live on the edge. That's the call of the gospel. Therefore, make it known to all nations.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll call it that, the podcast, Living on the Edge. It makes sense. And that's a clear message coming out of this. Chris, how can people be in touch with you? What do you want to promote? Any books, any podcasts?
Yeah, love them to check out Making Disciples podcast. We are Making Disciples website, where we host the podcast. But I would just say, if they want to catch up on anything I've talked about, just simply go and find a little red gospel to read. Go and find a New Testament. That's the best place to go.
Yeah. Well, listen, cheering you on in Bow and through all the other work. You're doing your doctorate on discipleship and also, the Spring Harvest stuff. There's a lot that you're juggling. Pray blessing on Becky and the kids. And thanks so much for your time, Chris.
Bless you. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Guys, it's been great, hasn't it? Another fantastic week. If you have been inspired, if it's done what it said on the tin, then please give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes. Check out Chris's stuff. We'll put that in the blurb. If you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbert.com or any of the social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, we've got another fantastic guest. In the meantime, you guys go for glory, and we'll see you next time. Toodaloo.